You're listening to The Secret to My Success, an interview-style podcast that asks our guests what trait, skill, or characteristic they possess that's made them a success. Hosted by Shelby Skurhawk.
So, Mariana, I want to know, what do you do when you're off the clock, so to speak?
Off the clock. Let's see. I don't actually know what that means.
Right.
Because in my life, I work, 60 hours a week. And when I'm not working, I'm a mom. So I'm not off the clock then either because you got mommy duty.
Yeah.
And I sleep. Sleeping's technically off the clock. I sleep.
Yes. You probably don't get enough of that either.
No, 4 hours last night.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think a lot of people have that same schedule outline where they are working a lot, whether that's in a traditional office setting or if it's in our situation where we're, our own bosses, we're freelancing, we're picking up assignments and working on projects a little bit here and there. For us, I don't know if there's a set 8 to 5 schedule. It's kind of, you work on and work off, and whenever you can find some time to get some more work in, I think that's your typical work day. So you're right, there isn't a whole lot of off the clock time. But our guest today, Laura Vanderkam, that's the title of her new book, Off the Clock. And, she's, of course, the very successful author of What the Most Successful People Do Before Breakfast, 168 hours, and I Know How She Does It. What the Most Successful People Do Before Breakfast, that was a huge bestseller.
Right.
Because I think that precisely identified the right habits and productivity techniques for people to really make the most of their time. So what Laura says in this new book is, okay, so tracking your time, knowing where your time is going, that's all very important. And we talk a little bit about really just the sheer challenge of that. I'll admit, I tried tracking my time and I lasted a whole day because, not that it's necessarily difficult or time consuming. It's fairly simple. There's lots of apps, even just, old school pen and paper, kind of keeping track of your day in 30-minute segments or even hour-long segments. It's not that hard in principle, but in theory, what I realized quickly is that when I thought I was working, I'm not always working. I think I especially have a tendency to kind of let my mind wander because, that is when I can do my most creative work, but often it requires that mind muscle of being able to rein it back in of, okay, well, letting your mind wander to this topic and then this topic, and then maybe that gives you an idea to write about something for, maybe 3 or 4 steps down the road, but being able to rein that in and be like, okay, so now let's pull that back and let's be able to put some pen to paper, so to speak, and get some work done.
So I've been trying to track my time. Tracking time is hard, but what it does allow you to do is learn that you have to set times for certain things. So like I've started saying, okay, this is designated time for this client. And then within that time frame, I designate certain hours or minutes or whatever to specific projects for that client or specific elements. And then also you have your creativity time in the day or your hunting for new jobs time in the day or that kind of thing. Like if you set it in blocks and you have a specific target, your mind is less likely to wander. And I think it's upped my productivity a little bit, giving me a little bit more time in my off the clock hours, which, basically equates to more mommy time.
What have you found has been the, I guess the very hardest part though, of seeing where every single minute of your day goes?
I can't track the minutes, but like I got a new planner where I write it all out of, and I do it the day before. And then also what I've learned is, so I have different accounts, like different emails for different clients and all that kind of stuff. And I don't open them. Like I have different windows on my desktop. I don't open the window for the other client, or I don't open Facebook, or I don't open anything that could potentially be a distraction, so that my crazy monkey brain doesn't try to jump to something else. Like if it's
Right.
not open and I have to go open it, that's like a
Yeah.
barrier to entry for actually like crossing over and doing something that I'm not supposed to be doing right then. And the same thing qualifies for off the clock time. Like I've realized like if I'm going to actually say, okay, I'm not going to work tonight, I
Yep.
turn off my computer. And if I turn off my computer, I'm way less likely to get back on it and work when I really need the downtime, because you need the
Absolutely.
downtime.
Well, and so I'm really impressed. It sounds like you've created some separation techniques to be able to separate time that you're working, and then within that, even specific time to specific clients, and then also tracking, and being able to separate your time at home. So the premise of Laura's book is, her the full title is Off the Clock: Feel Less Busy While Getting More Done. And one thing that she points to is savoring the time that is off the clock. So of course that sounds a little bit of a cliche. Of course you should, when you're there, you should be there. But she likens just the process of when you're actually off the clock, fully realize what you're doing right then. So instead of just, turning off your computer and just being there for mommy time, realize that when you're able to play a game with your daughter and have that experience and something funny happens, like, fully savor that experience and even kind of make mental notes in your mind of what's happening. So just the way that you would make kind of mental notes and stay sharp when you're working, she says to apply the same thing to when you're off, because a lot of time what happens is that our off the clock time just kind of blends into one big long time period, and there's no I guess if you want to imagine a timeline, there's no those markers that say, oh, okay, well, on this day I did this and on this day I did this. And so it's easy to look back at a summer, for example, when the kids are off and be like, well, what did we do this summer? I don't know. I mean, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but realizing that if you're able to make kind of mental footnotes in your mind of those things that you've done in your off time, it makes you appreciate that off time more, and it gives you that better balance, of course, where you need as much off time as you do on time, because that's kind of how you're going to be most successful.
So I bet that I have not read her book. I probably should. But I bet there's a whole chapter in there or a section dedicated to digital detox or putting away your phone when you are in that off time, because electronics tend to be one of the biggest distractions and they take you away from actually focusing on the moment and being there and being present and taking it in, versus when you have a phone out or an iPad or a TV running or something else that's there, you have split focus automatically. Because what if you get a notification from Facebook, or what if you get a notification from news or whatever like that? So I bet you there's a chapter in there about that.
Yes, you're right, and she talks about a little bit of the time paradox that often when you think you're working a certain number of hours a week, again, when you really boil it down to that, and we've interviewed Laura a couple of times on our previous success podcast. And that was one of the
Hmm.
fascinating things that she said, is that everybody, I think, assumes that they're working a certain number of hours because that's how they want to see themselves. But then oftentimes it doesn't end up being that much. And that's not a put down or a something to kind of to dog you. It's realizing that, again, within that time, there's lots of little moments that kind of get stolen away by just kind of mindlessness. And so if you're able to pinpoint where all those times go, and in her case with the book saying both when you're working and when you're not working, that certainly leads to a better overall balance. And you're right, being able to put away those addictive little devices that are easily time zappers and just mind zappers. That's certainly a huge component of it. So Laura shares all of those things with us in our interview next. Laura Vanderkam can tell you what she was doing at 10 a.m., April 8th, 2016, or June 13th, or any other exact date in the past few years. She doesn't have a Rain Man memory or anything. She just simply tracks her time every day. And diligently tracking her time, she's learned really how much time there is in the 168 hours of a week. She's written 6 books on the topic, including her most popular bestseller, What the Most Successful People Do Before Breakfast, and now her newest book, Off the Clock, Feel Less Busy While Getting More Done. Today, we're going to talk about Laura's secret to success, which is understanding where her time goes and being diligently mindful about making the very best use of her time. And that doesn't have to mean working or doing more. So, Laura, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, for those of for the audience that isn't familiar with your work, will you just share quickly the how and why of time tracking and how it became your life's work?
Yeah, well, I do think that time tracking is a fascinating topic. I haven't been doing this forever. I've been doing it for 3 years now, tracking my time. I came to this topic a couple of years ago. I, started writing about time management, and people would say, "Well, I want to spend my time better." And I realized, well, how can we spend our time better if we don't know how we're spending it now? I mean, you think about making a business decision, you'd want to know, like, here's this store's sales and this store's sales before we decide, like, oh, for sure this one we should do this, or you want to have good data before you make a decision. So it's the same thing with time. You want to make sure you know for sure where the time goes, so you are able to change the right thing, because it could always happen that something you think was a problem really isn't, or maybe something you've never even considered was taking more time than you might have imagined. So I'd always been telling people to track their time, and I had tracked my time for a week here and there over the years. But then a couple of years ago, I realized, life was pretty full, a lot going on. It was a time that I was hoping to remember more of. And so I just decided to track my time continuously. And I learned a lot from the experience. I've been able to write about it a lot, and I share some of that in Off the Clock.
So, what I'm particularly fascinated by is the psychology of tracking your time. So, I mean, we do all have the same 168 hours in a week, but we constantly feel behind and really unsure how to escape that busyness. But you make the important argument in your books that we kind of create this false narrative of time poverty. Will you explain that a little bit, especially for someone who's listening right now who's saying, but no, you should see my schedule. I really don't have enough time in the week.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I had an exchange on Twitter, of all places, a couple of days ago. Somebody wrote something about my book, and they put the headline, "You're not as busy as you think." And the person like, "No, really, I am." I'm like, "But here we are on Twitter." So,
Right.
there is a certain aspect of this. Because our narrative of our lives is often shaped by our busiest moments, because we want to see ourselves as busy people. Saying we're busy means that the demand for our time is high, which means that we're very important. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. The problem with this busy narrative is that we start to believe it, and we start to believe that we don't have space in our lives for the things that are important to us. At this point, I've seen thousands of time logs, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone's log who couldn't find some space for something that they wish to do. I'm not saying gobs of time, and I'm not saying that people have incredible quantities of free time. Generally, people don't have as much as they might want, but not as much as I want is a very different story from none. So we want to make sure that we're telling a story that is useful, because not as much as I want, we can do something with. You can scale up that time maybe over time, and we can also make good choices within the leisure time that we do have, in order to make sure that it's the most rejuvenating thing possible.
Well, and you bring up this this point about wanting to be busy. I mean, there is certainly that's a real thing of this ego of wanting to be the type of person that always works 50 hours a week or always works 60 hours, because it's kind of become in our culture that, oh, you only work 40 hours a week, man, you must be a slacker.
Well, although the funny thing is, many people overestimate how much they work. And I always see this, all the time on logs. People, write me, they're like, well, I work 60, 65 hours a week most of the time. Send me a time log and it's got 42 hours of work on it for the week. And it's like, well,
Mhm.
okay, either this was a really light week or your numbers are off.
Right.
And what it usually is that the person worked one 12-hour day during the week. Although, again, by 12 hours, I mean, like, they were in the office from 8 to 8. They weren't working the whole time. But okay,
Sure.
let's say that it's 12 hours. So then they multiply that by 5. That gives them 60. And then they're like, oh, well, I was probably working a lot this weekend too. Oh, let's say 65, maybe even 70 hours a week. But it wasn't. Like, the 12 hours was the longest they worked. They weren't working that whole time either. And that's how you get a number that's more in the like mid 40s when you actually force people to keep track of it. And I laugh about this, but I do it too. I mean, I had been telling myself that I worked about 50 hours a week because I had tracked my time for a few weeks here and there over the years and had always worked about 50 hours during those weeks. And then when I started tracking my time continuously in April 2015, I realized that I had in the past chosen very specific weeks to track,
Yeah.
namely those weeks when I had worked 50 hours a week, because I had this vision of myself as the kind of person who was working 50 hours a week. And, when I tracked all my time, obviously I couldn't do that. I saw that the long-term average was a lot closer to 40 when I first started tracking. And, 40 is a different number than 50. And here I write about this and speak about this, and my number was off too. And that doesn't mean that I never worked 50 hours. There's many weeks that I worked 50 hours. There were weeks I worked 60 hours. It's just that those were no more typical than the weeks when I wound up working 20 hours for some reason or another. And so I think it's this question of what is a typical week that tends to give people false impressions of their lives. So yeah, there is this narrative of busyness and this narrative of overwork. I would challenge people to make sure that they do know how many hours they're working. It's not just this number that they've come up with in a quest to, one up everyone else around them, or because they
Right.
feel like they're working very hard. You want to know the number. Again, not because we're playing gotcha or anything like that, but because we can make good choices with that time. If we're unhappy with that number, maybe we can change it. And, we can also make sure that it's not keeping us from doing other things, because, people walk around with a story of like, oh, I'm working 100 hours a week, and it turns out it's closer to 60. Well, that's great, because then there's this time for other stuff. And
Right.
that's good to see that, right? Like, so let's figure that out.
The prospect of tracking my time like that, this is something that I've wanted to do. I mean, I've interviewed you a few times now, back at the Success Podcast, and every time that I talk to you, I get all excited about, okay, I am going to track my time. Right. I'm going to do it finally. But I realize that I really am afraid to track my time, because I already have this kind of internal narrative of not of, oh, I'm working 60 hours a week. And I'm afraid I'm afraid that I know I'm not as productive as I should be, that there's so much stuff I want to do that doesn't get done in a week, that I'm like, okay, well, clearly I'm not using my time well. And so the reason why I'm afraid to track my time is I'm afraid to see it on paper plainly there, that, I spent 3 hours trying to start a story, trying to write something that it just wasn't coming. And I kept on trying and trying and nothing was happening. And so that wasn't really productive time. So my question though is, how do you convince someone like me that tracking my time won't just make me feel worse?
Well, it might make you feel better. I mean, because that's it can give you useful information. Like, you see, like, oh, well, maybe that was a lower energy time of day that I was
Yeah.
trying to write this story, and I was setting
That's true.
myself up for failure. Because look, here's another day where I was able to crank out something in an hour flat, and it was great. Let's look at that and see what the difference was. It's not that I'm a good or bad person. It's just that I was setting myself up for success one day, and on the other day, I didn't have the energy to do it. And so that can be helpful. I think it's the same thing with, like, people try to lose weight. A nutritionist will tell you to keep a food journal. and yet people don't want to do it. And it's because
Yeah.
the same reason we don't want to know, like, yeah, I grabbed 6 cookies from the kitchen next to my home office over the course of the day. And but it doesn't, tracking it doesn't change the reality that that happened. I mean, it's like, it happened.
Plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability. And it's the same thing with time. Like, it doesn't change what happened. If anything, tracking can sometimes keep us a little bit more in check, because we don't want to write down like the 2-hour Instagram bender or something like that. And
Right.
so it can encourage us to make better choices at the time. I guess the one thing I would say is, you don't have to do it forever. Like, I'm a bit of a time management freak, that I've done this for 3 years now. It doesn't take me much time at all, in case anyone's concerned about that. I check
Yeah.
in probably 3 times a day and write down what I've done since the last time. So it's about a 3-minute a day investment of time. So very similar to brushing my teeth, which is an
Right.
activity that I, continue to do and have yet to see reason to question. So it's not that big a deal. Do it for 1 week, see what you think. Just to get a good idea of the landscape of your life. And then you can decide, like, do I like it? Do I not like it? There are some things you probably love, and that's great. You should celebrate those. So often looking at a time log will help show what you should celebrate.
Yeah.
There may be things that you don't like, and that can be, now you have useful information to change it.
Right. Well, so in the book, you talk about strategies for feeling off the clock, because again, the title of the book is "Off the Clock: Feel Less Busy While Getting More Done," and so that primarily is teaching this mindset shift to help you feel calm on your very busiest days, and then having tools to help you get more done without feeling overwhelmed. So, feeling off the clock, what is that feeling?
Well, to me, being off the clock is a sense of time freedom. And I know your listeners are probably like, wait a second, like, we've just been talking time tracking for the last several minutes. Where does this fit? Like, that sounds like the exact opposite of
Right,
being
right.
off the clock. Like, the fact that I know how I was spending my time at 10 a.m. on April 8th, 2016 or something.
Yeah.
But I really do believe that time discipline leads to time freedom, because often, busy people feel like they can't relax because there's a million other things that they should be doing, or that they haven't, got projects moving forward as they should, or maybe something will come up, or am I putting adequate time against this, or when am I going to tackle this? Those are the things that keep us from feeling off the clock. Whereas when you know where your time goes, and when you have a good plan for the things that you would like to do, and you've been very diligent about getting rid of the things that aren't the best use of your time, then you can relax. Then you can feel this sense of time abundance. And so it's that sense of time abundance in the midst of a full life that I'm really trying to encourage people to embrace.
Well, and that reminds me of, I'm fairly new at this idea of time freedom. I mean, for 12 years, I worked in corporate. And so, I was, 8 to 5 or 9-ish to, 5:30 or 6. And then I had this kind of second shift, like lots of working moms do, where, once the kid was in bed, then okay, time to start working at 10 p.m. and maybe work till 12 or 1 and then start the cycle all over again. So the idea of being able to have this time at home that I am completely in charge of my own time is certainly a new concept. But when you say this feeling off the clock, I guess I liken it to, and this is so people can understand, if you've got at the beginning of a week your to-do list, which is a very good success strategy. By the end of the previous week, have your list of what you're going to do the next week. So that way, Monday morning, especially if you're not a morning person, you can hit the ground running instead of sitting there staring at your planner going, what do I need to do this week? So getting those things done earlier in the week, then that's where you can feel that time freedom. I mean, is kind of that idea that, okay, I got the things that I needed to get done. And so, now this Friday afternoon, I don't have to feel guilty about not working necessarily. I've done the things I need to do, and I can feel a little bit off the clock. So I can, research something that I'm just interested in, maybe go into a rabbit hole of research, or take time off and do something for myself. Is that then this off the clock feeling?
I would say that's a great characterization of it. And yeah, I totally agree with you. Make your priority list for the next week by Friday afternoon so you can hit the ground running on Monday. And definitely that pro tip of front loading the week. Because, stuff is going to come up. It could be good stuff, could be bad stuff. It's probably a little bit of both. But the more of the stuff that you have to do is tackled toward the front of the week, the more space you have at the end of the week. And it just feels great to be hitting Friday knowing like, yeah, I got all that stuff done. and
Right.
I feel relaxed, and I feel like I can explore various topics. And yeah, no, I mean, when we're not frantically racing to get stuff done right before a deadline, you feel far more relaxed about time. And when you feel relaxed about time, you feel like time is abundant. Whereas, I mean, feeling rushed and harried, of course, you feel like there isn't enough time. That's pretty much
Mm-hmm.
the definition of rushed and harried, is that there isn't enough time.
One thing that I found interesting in the book was a little bit of the mental aspect of how we perceive time and memories. One phrase that you wrote that I really liked was that that basically that you were addressing a graduating class, and so I mean these are young people, and they had more time than memories, where we or older people have more memories than time. So what I found interesting then is that, and I wrote this quote down because it started getting me thinking about um, the context of memories, and when looking back at things, because you write a lot about this. So you write, the existence of memories has profound implications for how we feel about time, whether it is scarce or abundant, whether it feels full or like it has slipped through our fingers. That basically the how we feel about it really has to do with the existence of these memories. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so memory is actually a key component of time perception. I had a couple, researchers explain these concepts to me. But when we think about time, um, sort of the number of memory units that is associated with a period of time is what establishes our sense of how long that time was. So if you think about like the first day of a vacation somewhere kind
Mm-hmm.
of exotic, like it seems really long. And that's
Yeah.
because so much is new and you're creating all these new memories and your brain has no idea what it's going to need to remember. So it's sort of remembering all of it. And that makes that time seem very vast. Whereas like your average Tuesday, like you're just doing the same thing you've done every Tuesday for years. And so
Yeah.
there's nothing new about it, there's nothing to remember, and so it tends to sort of slip through your fingers. And so the way to kind of combat this, I mean, obviously we can't make every day profound and different, but you can at least put in little adventures into your life and say, well, why is today different from other days? Like, what is different about today? Why should I remember it? And if you can answer that question, well, then you are far more likely to remember the day. And
Mm-hmm.
that can make time seem more rich and vast as opposed to like it's simply slipping from one side of the hourglass to the other.
That feeling of slipping through the fingers. I started to form a thought, and I don't understand, I guess, the psychology of it. So whenever I look back at old photos or old videos of my son when he was small, I have the hardest. It's I feel that ache there. And for most people, looking at old videos of your children when they were younger, that should be a great feeling. But I have the hardest time doing it. It feels, it for some reason, it kind of aches. And I think it has to do with maybe how fast the time went. And now I realize how quickly time is going. So, again, when you write about the existence of memories and how that has implications for how we feel about time, I guess my question is, why do some people, how can they look back at memories and feel happy and fulfilled and be able to remember the way that they felt, or the way that something smelled, or, anything about that day, where others, have a difficult time looking back at those memories, and really kind of have buried it. And I'm saying that outside of, major tragedy, major, drama or anything like that, just that perception of time.
Well,
You know
I
what I
mean,
mean?
memories that can be bittersweet in general, and I think that the word nostalgia is actually homecoming and ache, right? Like it's
From
this
Greek, yeah.
yeah, that, but they're both part of it. This sense of coming back to our past, and yet this ache of it, because it is time past that is never coming back. And that's okay. I mean, it's that tug of dueling emotions that is what makes sort of the richness of the human condition. And so we shouldn't expect to have things be 100% happy. It's that wistfulness of it as well, that makes things more profound. I think you can sort of direct that memory conjuring aspect of it. Like, I mean, try to look at something specifically that you would like to recall, and specifically think of the funny aspects of it, or the humorous, or like, oh, remember when that happened. I think, one of the things that the issue with the video is we realize how much of it we don't remember too.
Yeah.
It can be a
Yeah.
trigger for that. And that is what it is, although so much of memory can be recalled. I have a quote from Robert Grudin, who's a philosopher of time, talking that memory is seldom totally beyond recall if we work at it. If we know there are things that we have forgotten, then we can really work to conjure them up. So it might involve talking to people from that period of time. It might be, really studying photos from that period of time, or anything that you wrote at that period of time. Which, now, again, the past, what's done is done to a degree, but knowing that, you can also help your future self with that by trying to track some of these things now. So, it's always hard to nudge ourselves to do things like keep a journal or take photos sort of mindfully and then do something with them, as opposed to just having them sitting on our phone, or by time logs. In fact, having these time logs from the past 3 years, it reminds me so much of my youngest child's babyhood, because I started tracking when he was about 3 months old. And so the fact is, I have this document of, almost his entire life. And that's not to say that my active brain would remember all of it, but I know it's all there.
Right.
Which the artifacts are what can help conjure it up. So, people listening to this might, you're asking, well, what's a reason to try tracking my time? I mean, whether you care about like how much time I spent watching TV, or in the car, or, emptying the dishwasher, or whatever it is, it's also a memory keeping aspect.
Right.
And having these memories is what helps make time feel more vast.
And so in the book, you say that, good memories do tend to make time expand. And you give some strategies for how to really linger in those experiences while they're happening. Can you share some of those tips for kind of realizing memories in the moment, if you will?
Yeah, the idea of lingering and savoring time is definitely part of making time feel richer and fuller, and changing our perspective on time. There's a couple strategies. A big part of it is recognizing that the present does sort of flee quickly, gone in this instant of becoming, to quote William James, but you can stretch it by looking at other dimensions of time too. So one is that you want to try and plan in pleasurable stuff, so you can anticipate it, because anticipation stretches the pleasure. If you think about like a 2-hour concert is only a 2-hour concert, but if you get the tickets 2 months ahead of time, you get to look forward to it for 2 months. And so that stretches the pleasure far beyond those 2 hours. In the moment itself, you try to fully pay attention, take in details, think about how you'll tell the story to someone later. If you're there with people, talk about how much you're enjoying it. Talk about the memories that you're making right there with them as you're paying attention. Move slowly if you can. The slower we move, the sort of more we take in. So definitely don't feel like you're rushing. As much as possible, pay attention to things and not have your brain be elsewhere. And then after the fact, do what you can to cement the memory. So a lot of that is recounting it to someone else. So make sure you're telling the story to someone, because that allows you to relive the pleasure. And in fact, allows you to sometimes have more pleasure from the experience than you do in the moment. Because, I mean, the thing about the present is that we obviously experience it as ourselves, like in our
Mhm.
physical bodies, which means that complete bliss is almost never possible. Like, you could be at the world's best concert, your favorite band on a lovely summer evening, with someone you deeply love next to you, and you're like, my toe itches.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, I have to go to the bathroom. Like, there's just all sorts of reasons that you're not going to be completely blissful in the moment. But when you're telling the story afterwards, and remember, you're not going to be talking about your itchy toe. So
Yeah.
you can have this bliss in the aftermath. And so when you recount the experience, it will be happier than it was in the moment. And so sometimes that can help with it too. You can recognize that too. But yeah, so think about the anticipation, the being fully present in the moment, and how you'll recount it afterwards, and then revisit the memory again frequently. And that also stretches the experience of time.
And this, you talk about this in almost a good clinical, like studied way in literally describing the three selves: the anticipating self, the experiencing self, and the remembering self. And that's exactly what you've then described: the anticipation of looking forward to a concert, just like when we were kids and we used to really, like, we got that feeling in our stomach, that getting excited for our birthday or getting excited for Christmas. I guess try to live that sort of anticipation, the experiencing self. So when you're in it right there, yes, you're going to be, oh, my back aches, or, oh, it's really hot, but trying to make yourself aware of what's happening. And then you said the remembering self, which is the retelling it and the recalling it to others. All of those three selves are then important in, I guess, cementing memories.
Yeah. And, but you can do this for things that you don't build in as well. You can savor good time that you haven't planned in too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's harder because daily life, your brain sort of walks around in this negative state. The background state is sort of neutral to negative. Most people aren't walking around in this total state of bliss all the time, but you can kind of notice when something is good, like just sort of pause and be like, hey, there is nothing wrong, right? Or I am not unhappy now. Actually,
Right.
this is pretty good. I feel happy. I feel, content. The sun is shining. No one's yelling. Whatever it
Yeah.
is, that
Yeah.
is a good moment. And to notice it, and the more of these sort of good moments that you notice, you can then because you're noticing them, that stretches the experience of time too. A noticed moment doesn't disappear. And it's avoiding this time disappearing that is the key component of feeling like we have more time.
Well, and that sounds exactly like the practice of mindfulness, which, on the surface, for somebody that's not really acquainted with the idea, it sounds a little bit, nebulous, a little bit airy fairy. But the way I've always thought of it and explained it is that, and I kind of couple this with gratitude also, that being mindful of what I'm feeling right now, and it can literally be, I'm not hot, I'm not cold, I'm a good comfortable temperature. I like what I've got what I'm wearing. It's, I like it here in my home office. Things are good. Like, basically just, I guess, taking that temperature of what's happening, and that can then, help cement those memories, or just basically realizing things in the moment, and that will help expand the time. Is that, my understanding that right?
Yeah. And just also noticing when you're happy, like what we notice eventually becomes our narrative. And it's very easy to notice bad moments, stressful
Yes.
moments,
Yep.
harried moments. And so consciously choosing to notice other moments can help change that narrative.
Absolutely. So, another thing you talk about in the book is designing your realistic ideal day. So, explain that a little bit, and then will you share what your realistic ideal day is?
Yeah, so the realistic ideal day, one of the women I interviewed for this book had been talking about this. I mean, people can think about like the perfect day or something, but if you think about it, perfect day is kind of a reach. I mean,
Yeah.
my perfect day, there'd be flying cars. So I wouldn't be ever stuck in traffic. And obviously that is unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Yes.
Whereas the realistic ideal day at least looks at sort of within the constraints of your current life and your circumstances, there are certainly days that are better than others. And so what would a really good, realistic day contain? And so she had various ideas of projects she would be doing and reading and stuff like that. I don't know. I guess for my realistic ideal day, I always like to, go for a good run somewhere pretty. So if it's a day where I didn't have to run on the treadmill because I wasn't trying to fit it in like 15 minutes and it was raining, that would be great. I like to eat good food. I like to read good books. I would spend my morning writing on a project that I care about, which tends to be books. I really like writing longer works. So I'd be deeply absorbed in that. Maybe having some interesting conversations in the afternoon with people talking about ideas that I find fascinating. So all things like that,
Yeah.
that make for a good day. Obviously I travel too, and I try and think about like when I travel, what makes for a good day. And again,
Mhm.
it often tends to be that I've eaten somewhere nice or seen something pretty. Like if I'm visiting a town to give a speech, like can I see something other than the inside of my hotel?
Right, right.
That's always great when my scenery is not just the hotel hallway. So thinking about how I can make the most of time.
Absolutely. And then of course, in having tracked your time, you've been able to realize how much time there really is there. So you can really take the time literally to smell the roses and take in all that is good, and just by slowing down instead of, I guess, this harried pace that most of us tend to default to.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen that. I mean, I feel like I have a fairly full life. I mean, I work and I have 4 kids and I do various other things, but there's still space. There's always some space. And that's actually been one of the helpful things for me of seeing like, well, I thought I wasn't reading that much. I wasn't putting all that much attention to what I was reading. And then I tracked my time and realized, actually I was reading a fair amount. It's just a lot of it was magazines and stuff. And so once I knew that that time was there, I could be a bit more intentional about it and try to read more real literature. And so I've definitely been making a point of doing that, or recognizing that I was spending over an hour a day in the car. So trying to use some of that time better. If I'm transporting a kid somewhere, obviously I got to talk to the kid, but if I'm in the car by myself, what am I going to listen to? And I had just been listening to the radio and that wasn't really improving my mood all that much. So I've
Yeah, yeah.
about listening to better things.
Excellent. Well, before we wrap up, I have just a few quick kind of rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. What movie can you quote by heart?
It's kind of sad. I'm just not much of a movie person, so I don't think there's any movies that I can except maybe parts of Frozen, just because it keeps playing in the house.
Right, right.
Or
I
Cars, my
understand.
kids' movies, not because I'm watching them so much. It's
They're always on in the background.
yes, exactly.
What's the very best piece of advice you've ever gotten?
So one of my favorites that has really influenced how I think about time, as a woman once said to me when explaining how she accomplished so much in her life, that rather than say, I don't have time to do X, Y, or Z, she'd say, I don't do X, Y, or Z because it's not a priority. So I
Yes.
don't have time really means it's not a priority. And
Yeah,
that's generally true. And
absolutely.
so if the more we own that truth and work with that, I think generally the better off we are.
What's the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten?
Uh, well, um, I'm trying to think. I tend to just ignore advice that I don't think is
Yeah,
very helpful. So
right.
I am, certainly people have said that, oh, writing is not a good career choice. But if you truly love something, you can make it work. There's lots. I mean, I am practical within it. There's a reason I write about time management and time as opposed to like trying to make my living doing experimental poetry. But you could probably make it work.
Right. And then finally, circling back to our theme, what would you say is your secret to success?
I really do think that small things done repeatedly add up. And so I'm really grateful in life that I am not much of a perfectionist. I am happy to just do a little bit and then do a little bit the next day and do a little bit the
Right.
next day, and knowing that whatever I've done is probably not great the first time, but I can leave space to come back to it and do a little bit more. And things do tend to get better over time. So, in general, that's how I like to approach life. I've started a new habit in January of writing 500 words of fiction a day, just as a way to keep that skill sharp
Wow. Yeah.
as well. And if you think about it, 500 words every workday since January means that there's, more than 60,000 words there
Yeah.
now. And that 500 words is nothing. Like, I mean, you've probably sent that number of words in emails by like 10 a.m.
Yeah.
Or earlier, honestly. And so it's really just about doing it intentionally and continuing and just keep going.
Well, excellent. I really, really do appreciate all of your time. And I'm hoping that I can now finally muster that courage to start tracking my time. And hopefully our listeners will follow suit and be able to find some good nuggets of information for themselves.
I hope they will. I really think it's useful. You don't have to do it for the rest of your life, but a week here and there is helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.